It was March 1944. Deep in the jungles of northern Burma, a Japanese garrison of 800 soldiers occupied a position they believed was impregnable. They controlled a strategic railway junction that supplied Japanese forces throughout the region. They had fortified bunkers. They had artillery. They had clear fields of fire in all directions. More importantly, they had the jungle. The dense, suffocating jungle of Burma that had swallowed countless Allied patrols. The jungle where visibility was measured in feet, not yards, where every shadow could hide an enemy, where the humidity turned metal to rust and turned men to exhausted, disease-ridden shadows of themselves. The Japanese soldiers had learned to live in this jungle. They had learned its rhythms. They knew the sounds of the forest at night, the calls of birds, the movement of animals, the patterns of wind through the canopy. They felt safe. The jungle was their ally, their fortress, their protection. They were catastrophically wrong, because approaching through that jungle was a British force unlike anything the Japanese had encountered before. A unit that had been specifically trained to turn the jungle from a fortress into a weapon. A force that understood something the Japanese hadn't realized. In the jungle, sound travels farther than sight, and fear spreads faster than bullets. They were called the Chindits, and they were about to teach the Japanese that the jungle wasn't a fortress. It was a stage. And they were about to perform the most terrifying show in military history. The man who invented jungle terror, Brigadier Ord Wingate, was not a conventional military officer. He was eccentric, brilliant, controversial, and possibly insane. He ate raw onions like apples. He brushed his body hair with a toothbrush instead of bathing. He quoted the Old Testament in military briefings. But Wingate understood something about jungle warfare that conventional military thinking missed. In the jungle, psychology matters more than firepower. Wingate had studied guerrilla warfare extensively. He had served in Palestine and Ethiopia, where he had learned unconventional tactics from irregular forces. He understood that small units operating behind enemy lines could create strategic effects disproportionate to their size, not through direct combat, but through psychological disruption. When he was given command of British forces in Burma, Wingate proposed something radical: create long-range penetration units that would operate deep behind Japanese lines. These units would avoid direct combat when possible. Instead, they would use psychological warfare to make Japanese soldiers believe they were being hunted by supernatural forces. The British High Command was skeptical. Psychological warfare had been used before, but Wingate's proposals seemed extreme. He wanted to use sound as a weapon. He wanted to make the jungle itself seem hostile to Japanese forces. He wanted to create the impression that British forces could be anywhere, everywhere, invisible and unstoppable. Most officers thought Wingate was mad, but Winston Churchill believed in him. And in February 1943, Wingate was authorized to form a special unit, the 77th Indian Infantry Brigade, better known as the Chindits. The name came from the Burmese word chintha, a mythological creature, half lion and half dragon, that guarded Buddhist temples. It was a fitting name. The Chindits would become mythological terrors to the Japanese soldiers they hunted. The sound weapon. The core of Wingate's psychological warfare strategy was sound. In the jungle, you heard the enemy long before you saw them. Sounds carried for hundreds of yards through the dense vegetation, and the human brain was hardwired to interpret unexpected sounds as threats. Wingate's team developed an array of acoustic weapons. The screaming units, portable speakers powered by hand-cranked generators that could broadcast pre-recorded sounds at high volume. The recordings included human screams, animal growls, mechanical noises that sounded like approaching armor, and most disturbingly, Japanese language broadcasts that seemed to come from nowhere. The percussion bombs, small explosive devices that created loud, resonant booms but minimal fragmentation. They were designed to be heard rather than to kill. Deployed around Japanese positions at night, they would create the impression of a massive artillery barrage happening all around the garrison. The animal collars, devices that mimicked the sounds of dangerous animals, tigers, elephants, wild boar. These were used to make Japanese soldiers believe they were surrounded not just by enemy troops, but by hostile wildlife. The voice projectors, megaphones with directional horns that could project a human voice for over 500 yards. Chindit operators, many of whom spoke Japanese, would use these to shout warnings, threats, and demoralization messages into Japanese positions. But the most effective weapon was human voices. The Chindits trained their soldiers to create coordinated screaming attacks. Hundreds of men positioned in a circle around a Japanese garrison would begin screaming simultaneously in the middle of the night. The sound was overwhelming, disorienting, and psychologically devastating. The training. The Chindits trained in the jungles of central India from March to December 1943. The training was unlike anything in conventional military doctrine. Soldiers were taught to move silently through jungle, not just quietly, silently. They learned to place their feet to avoid snapping twigs. They learned to move through vegetation without rustling leaves. They learned to control their breathing so it wouldn't be audible. They were taught jungle navigation using only sound and feel. They would be blindfolded and required to navigate through dense forest using hearing and touch. They learned to identify different types of vegetation by feel. They learned to sense obstacles in complete darkness. They were trained in psychological operations. They attended lectures on fear, stress, and sensory manipulation. They learned how to exploit the Japanese military mindset. They learned phrases in Japanese that would be maximally demoralizing to Japanese soldiers, and they practiced the screaming attacks. At first, British soldiers found it absurd. Grown men standing in formation, screaming at the top of their lungs for minutes at a time. It felt ridiculous, but the instructors explained the psychology. A human scream triggers primal fear responses. Multiple screams from different directions create disorientation. Prolonged screaming creates sustained psychological stress that accumulates over time. The soldiers practiced until screaming became a tactical skill. They learned to modulate volume, pitch, and duration for maximum psychological impact. They learned to coordinate with others to create waves of sound that would roll through the jungle like a physical force. By December 1943, the Chindits were ready. They had been transformed from conventional soldiers into something else entirely. They were psychological warriors, hunters of men's minds rather than their bodies. And in February 1944, they deployed to Burma to begin operations against Japanese forces that had no idea what was coming. The first contact. The first major Chindit operation targeted the Japanese garrison at Nampong, a railway junction in northern Burma. The garrison consisted of approximately 600 Japanese soldiers who had been occupying the position for 8 months. The Chindits didn't attack immediately. For 3 days, they observed the Japanese positions from concealment. They studied the routines. They identified the guard posts. They noted when soldiers slept, when they ate, when they were most alert, and when they were most vulnerable. Then, on the night of March 3, 1944, the psychological assault began. At 0200 hours, percussion bombs began detonating around the perimeter of the Japanese position. The explosions came from different directions, north, south, east, west, creating the impression that the garrison was surrounded by artillery. But there was no artillery, just small explosive charges creating noise. Japanese soldiers woke to what sounded like a massive bombardment. They rushed to their defensive positions. They prepared for assault, but no assault came. Just the periodic explosions, continuing randomly throughout the night. At 0300 hours, the screaming began. From the darkness beyond the Japanese perimeter, hundreds of voices began screaming. Not words, just raw primal screams. The sound came from all directions simultaneously. It echoed through the jungle. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The screaming continued for 15 minutes. Then it stopped. Silence returned. The jungle was quiet again. Japanese soldiers, now fully awake and deeply unsettled, waited for attack. But nothing happened. The night remained quiet. At 0400 hours, the voice projectors activated. A voice speaking perfect Japanese called out from the darkness, "You are surrounded. You cannot escape. We are watching you. We are waiting." Then silence again. This pattern continued throughout the night. Explosions, screaming, voices, then silence, then more explosions. The Japanese soldiers got no sleep. They remained at high alert for hours. They fired blindly into the jungle, wasting ammunition on shadows and sounds. By dawn, they were exhausted, frightened, and beginning to believe they were facing a force much larger than the actual 200 Chindits surrounding their position. The escalation. The psychological assault on Nampong continued for 5 nights. Each night, The Chindits varied their tactics to prevent Japanese soldiers from adapting. Night 2. The Chindits used animal collars to create the sounds of tigers approaching the garrison. Japanese soldiers, already on edge, fired at sounds. Some guards reported seeing massive predators in the darkness, though no tigers were actually present. Night 3. The Chindits broadcast recordings of Japanese military commands through their speakers, creating confusion about who was giving orders. Japanese officers found themselves countermanding orders they hadn't given, trying to reassert control over their troops. Night 4. The screaming attack was longer and more intense. The Chindits screamed for over an hour, creating waves of sound that rolled through the jungle. Some Japanese soldiers began screaming back, either in defiance or because they had mentally broken under the psychological pressure. Night 5. The Chindits combined all their tactics simultaneously. Explosions, screams, animal sounds, voice messages, all happening at once. The sensory overload was overwhelming. By the 6th day, the Japanese garrison at Nampong was psychologically destroyed. Soldiers were firing at shadows. Officers couldn't maintain discipline. Some men had abandoned their posts and fled into the jungle. Others refused to leave their bunkers even during daylight. The Chindits hadn't fired a single rifle round at the Japanese position. They hadn't assaulted the fortifications. They hadn't engaged in any conventional combat. But they had completely broken the Japanese garrison's ability to function as a military unit. On March 9th, the Chindits finally launched a conventional assault. The Japanese resistance was minimal. Soldiers surrendered or fled. The garrison that had seemed impregnable a week earlier collapsed within hours. The Chindits captured Nampong with fewer than 20 casualties. Japanese casualties were over 300, most of whom died trying to flee into the jungle rather than from direct combat. What happened at Nampong was studied intensively by British military psychologists. They interviewed captured Japanese soldiers to understand the psychological impact of the Chindit tactics. The accounts were remarkably consistent. Japanese soldiers described feeling hunted. They described believing they were surrounded by a massive force. They described hearing sounds that couldn't be explained, voices in the darkness, screams from nowhere, explosions that seemed to come from all directions. But most importantly, they described losing their sense of safety. The jungle, which they had believed was their fortress, had become hostile. They couldn't trust their senses. They couldn't sleep. They couldn't distinguish between real threats and psychological manipulation. One captured Japanese officer, Captain Hiroshi Tanaka, described the experience in detail during interrogation. On the first night, we believed we were under artillery bombardment. We expected assault, but no assault came. This was confusing. Why bombard our position without following up with attack? On the second night, we heard the screaming. This was worse than the explosions. Humans don't scream like that unless they're dying or insane. We thought perhaps the British were executing prisoners to intimidate us. Or perhaps they were insane themselves. By the third night, we understood this was psychological warfare. But understanding didn't make it less effective. We knew the screaming was designed to frighten us, but we were frightened anyway. We knew the voices in the darkness were meant to confuse us, but we were confused anyway. By the fifth night, we were hallucinating. Men reported seeing ghosts in the jungle. They reported hearing voices of dead comrades. They reported seeing British soldiers who weren't there. The lack of sleep combined with constant stress had broken our minds. When the actual assault came, we barely resisted. We were relieved that real combat had finally begun. Fighting a human enemy was preferable to fighting our own fears. DE. Expansion. After Nampong, the Chindits conducted similar operations against 7 other Japanese garrisons in northern Burma. The pattern was always the same. Isolate the garrison, conduct psychological assault for multiple nights, then launch conventional attack against a psychologically broken enemy. The tactics evolved with each operation. The Chindits learned what worked best. They refined their timing. They improved their sound equipment. They developed new recordings and new messages tailored to specific Japanese units. But they also encountered problems. The psychological warfare tactics were exhausting for the Chindits themselves. Screaming for hours every night damaged vocal cords. Operating hand-cranked generators in the jungle was physically demanding. Moving heavy sound equipment through dense forest was logistically challenging. Additionally, the tactics only worked under specific conditions. The jungle provided cover and amplified sound. In open terrain, the psychological effects were diminished. Against Japanese forces that had been warned about Chindit tactics, the element of surprise was lost. And there was a darker problem. Some Chindit soldiers began to enjoy the psychological torment they were inflicting. Some took pleasure in the fear they created. British officers had to discipline soldiers who were improvising cruel messages or extending psychological assaults beyond what was tactically necessary. Brigadier Wingate addressed this issue directly. In a memorandum to his officers, "We use psychological warfare because it is effective and because it saves British lives. But we must not become the monsters we pretend to be. The line between tactical deception and genuine cruelty is thin. We will not cross it. Our goal is to break enemy resistance, not to torture enemy minds for our amusement." The Japanese response. Japanese military command gradually became aware of Chindit psychological warfare tactics. They distributed intelligence reports describing the sound weapons. They warned garrisons to expect psychological assault. They also developed countermeasures. Some Japanese units adopted rotating sleep schedules so that at least some soldiers would be rested even if psychological attacks disrupted night sleep. Some units implemented strict light and noise discipline to avoid giving the Chindits targeting information. Some units prepared recorded music and propaganda that could be broadcast to counter British psychological operations. Most interestingly, some Japanese commanders adopted the Chindit tactics themselves. In several documented cases, Japanese forces conducted their own screaming attacks against British positions, using techniques clearly copied from Chindit operations. But these counter-tactics had limited effectiveness. The Chindits had tactical initiative. They chose when and where to engage. They could withdraw if a Japanese garrison proved too resilient. They could move to another target. The Japanese, defending fixed positions, couldn't choose whether to be targeted. They could only prepare and hope their preparations would be sufficient. The Battle of Broadway. The most significant Chindit operation was the Battle of Broadway in March 1944. Broadway was the code name for an area deep behind Japanese lines where the Chindits established a fortified base. The base was supplied by air. Gliders and transport aircraft would land on improvised airstrips, deliver supplies, and evacuate wounded. From Broadway, Chindit forces could strike at Japanese supply lines throughout the region. Japanese forces attempted to destroy Broadway multiple times. They attacked with infantry. They bombarded the position with artillery. They conducted air raids, but the Chindits turned their psychological warfare tactics defensive. They used their sound weapons to make Japanese attack forces believe they were walking into ambushes. They broadcast fake radio traffic that suggested British reinforcements were arriving. They created confusion in Japanese command and control. Japanese forces attempting to attack Broadway found themselves disoriented before they even made contact with British positions. They heard explosions that suggested minefields. They heard voices warning them in Japanese that they were surrounded. They heard sounds of armor that made them believe British tanks were present, even though no tanks could have been transported to that remote location. The psychological defenses were so effective that several Japanese assault forces broke off their attacks before ever engaging British positions. They retreated, convinced they were facing a force much larger and better equipped than the Chindits actually possessed. Broadway held for 3 months, far longer than Japanese command had believed possible. It became a symbol of British ability to project power deep into Japanese-controlled territory. The Chindits' psychological warfare campaign was strategically successful. But the human cost was significant. Of the approximately 10,000 Chindits who served in Burma, over 3,000 were casualties. Many died from disease, malaria, dysentery, typhus, rather than combat. The jungle was as deadly as any enemy, but the psychological casualties were equally severe. Many Chindits developed what would later be called PTSD. They suffered nightmares. They experienced anxiety and depression. Some developed auditory hallucinations, hearing the screams and explosions long after they'd left Burma. The use of sound as a weapon had psychological effects on the users as well as the targets. Screaming for hours created psychological associations that were difficult to break. Some Chindits found themselves unable to raise their voices without experiencing panic attacks. Others developed phobias about loud noises. British military psychologists eventually recognized that Chindit tactics, while effective, created unique psychological stresses. Soldiers were asking their own minds to do unnatural things, to create sounds designed to induce terror, to operate in sensory deprivation for extended periods, to suppress their own fear responses while trying to induce fear in others. One Chindit veteran, Corporal William Morrison, described the lasting psychological effects in a 1975 interview. "We became the nightmares we created. We spent months making other men afraid. We learned exactly what sounds, what words, what tactics would break someone's mind. And then we came home and discovered we'd broken our own minds in the process. I can't hear unexpected loud noises without experiencing panic. I can't sleep in complete darkness because I associate darkness with the jungle operations. I can't raise my voice in anger without feeling like I'm back in Burma, screaming into the darkness. We won our battles. We accomplished our mission. But we paid a price that nobody understood at the time. We became weapons. And weapons once used are never quite the same." The death of Wingate on March 24, 1944. Brigadier Ord Wingate died in a plane crash in the jungles of Burma. The B-25 Mitchell bomber carrying him and 9 others flew into a hillside during monsoon weather. There were no survivors. Wingate's death was controversial. Some believed it was simply a tragic accident. Others suspected sabotage, noting that Wingate had made enemies within the British military establishment who viewed his unconventional methods as dangerous. Regardless of the cause, Wingate's death demoralized the Chindits. He had been their inspirational leader, the visionary who had created their tactics and believed in their mission. Without Wingate, the Chindit operations lost much of their energy and innovation. The operations continued under new leadership, but they became more conventional. The psychological warfare tactics were de-emphasized in favor of traditional guerrilla operations. The sound weapons were used less frequently. The screaming attacks were gradually phased out. By June 1944, the Chindits had been redesignated as conventional infantry and integrated into the British 14th Army. The psychological warfare experiment was over. The historical assessment military historians have debated the effectiveness of Chindit psychological warfare operations for decades. Supporters argue that the Chindits tied down Japanese forces far beyond their actual numbers, that the psychological disruption created by their operations forced Japanese command to divert resources to defend positions that might otherwise have been left lightly guarded, that the terror they created in Japanese soldiers reduced enemy combat effectiveness throughout Burma. Critics argue that the Chindits' casualties were too high for the strategic benefits achieved, that conventional operations would have accomplished similar objectives with fewer losses. That psychological warfare, while innovative, was not decisive in determining the outcome of the Burma campaign. The truth is probably somewhere between these positions. The Chindits were effective but not decisive. They influenced the course of fighting in Burma but didn't determine its outcome. They proved that psychological warfare could be a valuable tool, but not that it could replace conventional military force. What is undeniable is that the Chindits changed how militaries thought about psychological operations. They demonstrated that sound could be weaponized, that fear could be as effective as firepower, that the human mind was as much a battlefield as physical terrain. The Japanese perspective decades after the war. Japanese veterans who had faced the Chindits were interviewed about their experiences. Many acknowledged that the psychological warfare had been highly effective. They described the fear and confusion created by the sound attacks. They admitted that some Japanese soldiers had broken psychologically before any physical combat occurred, but some Japanese veterans also expressed a kind of respect for the Chindits. They recognized that the British had developed innovative tactics appropriate to jungle warfare. They acknowledged that Japanese forces had been slow to adapt. One Japanese veteran, Sergeant Kenji Sato, who had faced Chindit operations at multiple locations, provided a particularly thoughtful assessment. The British understood something we didn't. In the jungle, your mind is your greatest enemy. You can train for physical combat. You can prepare for tactical situations. But you can't prepare for having your mind attacked. The Chindits made us fear the darkness. They made us fear the silence. They made us fear sounds that should have been harmless. They weaponized our own imaginations against us. In retrospect, I understand what they did and why it worked. but at the time it was terrifying. We felt like we were fighting ghosts, like the jungle itself had turned against us. The modern legacy today, the Chindit psychological warfare tactics are studied in military academies around the world as examples of innovative, unconventional warfare. Modern military forces use more sophisticated psychological operations, but the principles established by the Chindits remain relevant. Exploit enemy fears, create confusion, make the enemy feel hunted and unsafe, use minimal physical force to create maximum psychological effect. Sound continues to be used as a weapon, though in different forms. Acoustic devices, sound cannons, and audio deception systems are part of modern military arsenals. The underlying principle, that sound can create psychological effects that reduce enemy combat effectiveness, was proven by the Chindits in Burma. Special operations forces around the world study Chindit tactics. Navy SEALs, SAS, and other elite units incorporate elements of psychological warfare into their training. The concept of using fear as a weapon has become mainstream in special operations doctrine. The jungles of Burma where the Chindits conducted their operations remain largely unchanged. The railway junctions they fought over have been rebuilt or abandoned. The fortified positions have been reclaimed by vegetation. The airfields have disappeared beneath jungle growth. But local people in northern Burma still tell stories about the time when the jungle screamed. Stories about British soldiers who could make the forest itself fight for them. Stories about Japanese soldiers driven mad by sounds in the darkness. These stories have been passed down through generations. They've been embellished and mythologized, but at their core is a historical truth. For a brief period in 1944, the jungle in Burma became a psychological battlefield where sound was the primary weapon. In 2004, on the 60th anniversary of the Chindit operations, a memorial was erected in Burma to honor all the soldiers, British, Gurkha, and Japanese, who fought and died in that jungle. The inscription reads simply, "They fought in darkness. They fought with courage. They fought in a war where the battlefield was the human mind." It's a fitting memorial, because the Chindit operations were ultimately about psychology more than tactics, about fear more than firepower, about the realization that in jungle warfare, the most powerful weapon isn't a gun or a bomb. It's the scream in the darkness that makes men question their sanity. It's the voice from nowhere that makes them feel hunted. It's the sound that transforms a fortress into a trap. Japanese soldiers thought they were safe in their fortified positions. They thought the jungle protected them. They thought they understood the battlefield. Then the jungle started screaming. And everything they thought they knew was wrong. The Chindits proved that safety is an illusion, that fortifications are psychological constructs, that fear can defeat an army without firing a shot. Japanese soldiers learned this lesson in the most terrifying way possible, by having their minds turned into battlefields, by discovering that the enemy wasn't in front of them but inside their own heads, by realizing that the screaming jungle wasn't an external threat, but a reflection of their own terror. That is the legacy of the Chindits. Not the battles they won or the positions they captured, but the psychological warfare revolution they created. The understanding that in war, the human mind is both weapon and target, and sometimes, all it takes to break an army is to make the jungle scream.